Hello, folks. Well, how are you enjoying your journey through the letter of Ephesians? I know that you're enjoying it. It's rich, isn't it? Chapters 1, 2, and 3, some of the best theology about Christ and the church in all of the New Testament. It's just deep and thought-provoking and so informative about what God has done in Christ, and I could go on, but I won't. In this video, I want to talk with you about what we find in chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. Now, I mentioned in the last video that the church is one of the main emphases of this letter. I know that you have found that to be true. In fact, no other letter is so specifically focused on the doctrine of the church as Ephesians, and no other letter expresses such a high regard for the church as Ephesians. As support, I noticed the title of one of the books in my library. It's a book of sermons on Ephesians written by W.T. Hamilton. He's a longtime preacher who for several years worked for churches in Texas. And just a little trivia here for those who are interested. W.T. Hamilton married the youngest daughter of Gus Nichols, a well-known preacher in Alabama. And he's also the father of Nick Hamilton, another well-known preacher in Arkansas. Well, W.T. Hamilton passed away and went to his eternal reward in 1986 at the age of 65. And you know, we owe so much to these preachers. From three generations, Gus Nichols, W.T. Hamilton, Nick Hamilton, and to gospel preachers who have gone before us. We owe them so much, don't we? Anyway, back to my point. The title of his expository treatment of Ephesians is Glory in the Church. So that's just another anecdotal piece of evidence that this book is about the church, the letter of Paul to the Ephesians. And just take a look at what Paul tells us about the Lord's church in the text that we are reviewing today, Ephesians 2:11 through 20. It is the place or the community in which people of different races can overcome long-standing divisions and become one, united. Paul writes that this is what happened in the first century. Both Jew and Gentile have been made one in Christ, one with God and one with one another. That's verse 14. He tells us that the church is the place where reconciliation occurs. It is the body in which we are reconciled to God and to one another. Reconciliation, the mending of broken relationships. Well, the church is the place where broken relations can be mended. And in verses 19 through 22, Paul uses three figures to express what the church is: a city, a family, and a building. And that building is a very special building, isn't it? It's the temple of God, the place where God resides. So Paul tells us that God lives in his church. How important is the church in God's plan? And how valuable is this community of faith? But I should also mention that Ephesians is also about Christ. In fact, a theme that would fairly describe all of Ephesians is Christ and the church. Notice all that Paul says about Christ in our text. In Christ, those who were far off, the Gentiles, have been brought near, verse 13. And what was the agency by which this came about? Verse 13 says it was the blood of Christ that made it possible. According to verse 14, Jesus broke down the dividing wall that separated Jew from Gentile in his day. What was that wall? Perhaps Paul had in mind a literal wall. Perhaps the wall in the temple area at Jerusalem, which separated the court of the Gentiles from the inner courts. Or perhaps the dividing wall is the law that Paul says Jesus abolished in verse 15. And how did he end the hostilities? Verse 16, through the cross. Paul tells us that he preached peace, verse 17. That through him, through Jesus, we have been granted access in one spirit to the Father, verse 18. And that Jesus is the most important stone in this temple, which we are. He is the cornerstone, and it is in him that the building of God grows as the temple of God, verse 21. So, we learn so much about the church in this text, and we learn so much about what Jesus has done, or what God has done through Jesus. So today, we are praising God for what he has done through Christ, and we are reminding ourselves of the importance and the value of the church in God's plan. Now, how should we respond to these wonderful theological truths? Well, I'm going to leave that up to you this time. But of course, there are so many ways we can and should respond to these magnificent truths. I'll be back in a few days. Until then, God bless you in your study through this great letter.